the goResilient podcast. The key to understanding an argument is to understand its presuppositions. You could intuit yourself to the right answer by having correct presuppositions. So for example, you don't need to memorize tens of thousands of pages from academic textbooks or go to an expensive university to learn every single little detail about how things work in the natural world. The correct way to do it is to train yourself to recognize universal patterns that exist in nature. And this is kind of just like a holistic perspective, really. So I think one of the most important and influential presuppositions that I have is that you aren't separate from your environment. So any concept that I hear that presupposes that you as an individual are separated from your environment, like reducing you to being completely independent of your environment, that this can just immediately be identified as being incorrect. So the point is that if you hear something that has obviously incorrect presuppositions, you don't have to be an expert in each individual topic or defer to somebody to just properly identify that as wrong. I mean, it's kind of reverse engineering how analysis is supposed to work. It shouldn't be something that you memorize. The most powerful form of analysis is to be able to start with philosophically consistent principles and presuppositions, and then use those to evaluate new information going forward. So like if your system of analysis doesn't start from there, well, then you're not really analyzing anything.
And that's exactly, yeah, boy, so well put. The way you wrapped it up there was perfect. You're not exactly analyzing anything is really, I think, what it comes down to with a lot of people, because the presuppositions in many cases behind most people's arguments or beliefs are going totally unexamined, it seems to me. And a big part of that is this detachment from reality that you're describing. There are so many ideologies, especially the kind of postmodernist ideologies that have become so popular in the developed world in the last century or so, which are perfect examples of this detachment from one's physical and really, I would argue, even though it's maybe not as empirically demonstrable, spiritual context, things like feminism, for example, maybe not every iteration of it, but in particular, the kind of postmodern feminism, which essentially characterizes traditional motherhood and femininity as a form of oppression, as if the obvious biological circumstances of one's physical existence could ever be considered oppressive. Well, I mean, that's a massive presupposition to make, that basically anything that a person might not enjoy in some hedonistic sense is wrong and oppressive. Well, that should be obviously absurd. But if you live in a modern urban environment, which is an incredibly costly construct that drags resources from other points in the planet and concentrates them for very short terms in very damaging ways in certain places. You live in a place like that, you're essentially living like a mouse in a laboratory cage or something. You really have no concept of where anything comes from or how anything works. And so, yeah, I mean, if you presuppose that, well, then sure, the physical reality of a woman's body and the fact that she has children and sort of all of the social realities of that can be characterized as oppressive.
Well, in reference to your idea about postmodernism, I saw this post on Twitter yesterday. This girl at Reason is Fun. She apparently does a epistemology and philosophy podcast with David Deutsch from Oxford. But she tweeted, "If a theory makes you feel unsafe, it's not true." We're at a point where, like, I think most people don't really believe in anything. I think it's really modern education that forces that onto people, like where they literally just get used to memorizing things, and then whatever they're told, they just become like somebody who repeats it.
Yeah.
Like Like they're, I find when I talk to most people that they don't actually have any real philosophical beliefs that they believe to their core.
The cynicism is kind of obvious, I think, if you just observe the fact that you have the obviously safest group of people that has ever existed in the history of humanity, as far as we know, talking about feeling unsafe all the time. Who has ever been safer than the average sort of middle class, university educated white woman, who, for example, who is just happens to be a really common example of somebody who is made to feel unsafe, by some sort of a theory or anything like that.
I think you could correctly characterize postmodernism as just being a complete inversion of the natural order. I mean, I think that really
Yeah.
is like the best definition of what postmodernism actually is fundamentally. And then like when you read tweets like this or people saying these things, it's like, yeah, that's 100% inverted. It's absolutely entirely not only wrong, but it's like the opposite of correct. And the funniest part is that these people then have risen to be at the top of their respective fields, or that they're
Oh
somehow
yeah.
presented as the experts of it.
And are now in their desperation to somehow, I mean, I really think at scale, this is what it is. In their desperation to normalize all of this, they're trying to drag us all into a lot of these same pathologies.
Yeah, it is like it's a dangerous delusion that I mean, it's difficult with these people. I mean we've talked about this before where it's like they're not necessarily maliciously doing it. It's some complex form of social engineering where like they're trying to maintain the center and not acknowledge anything from the fringes, but what they're saying is so far out from where anybody would have been historically. This is a totally new path that they've gone down where it's really just testing people to see if they will say what they're being told to say.
There's definitely a kind of psyop element to it where you're supposed to, at least it seems that way to me. There's just so much obvious value in getting people to repeat loudly and proudly that 2 + 2 is 5. And it doesn't matter why or why not. It matters that we were told this. And, I think the more you frame things in that way, the more that whole understanding embeds itself into the society. I think that was a huge part of what, for example, the COVID scenario that we were all put through a few years ago was all about, was just, teaching, inculcating that obedience.
This brings up another good point. So I think it's also more than just having the correct presuppositions. It's also about understanding about how incentives work. And like during the COVID thing, I don't know if I've ever even said this, but like the first job that I had, I was a biotech analyst at a financial company. That was like the first job that I had. So like I was pretty familiar with reading FDA statements and analyzing drug treatments and things like that. So like I kind of understand the incentives of pharma a little bit. So like that's kind of where my, at least the first job that I had, where my background
Mm-hmm.
was. But like so when you understand how the incentives work and you compare that with like analyzing presuppositions, I mean, then you can really get a picture of what's going on. So like so much of it was just quote unquote, trust the experts. So, I mean,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that's obviously just the appeal to authority fallacy. And I mean, that's like pretty basic. So like most people should be able to understand that, it's basically just saying, listen to me because I'm in charge. Well, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if that's all that you have, that's like quite a bad argument. But even like if you don't understand the incentives of the individuals and the institutions that are pushing certain courses of action, then you're not really understanding the forces that are at play. The words that they're saying to get you to do something, that's just a strategy again to get you to do something, right? But like
Mm-hmm.
really
Mm-hmm.
it's part of this bigger institutional structure with like economic incentives, social incentives that are pushing this. And I think COVID was without a doubt the best example of that in our lifetimes.
Yeah, COVID was also another example to tie these things together. I think COVID was a really good example of the, how do I put it? I think the best framework that I've ever heard, I know I've mentioned this before, for really kind of understanding and tying all of these things together, whether it's COVID, whether it's a lot of these kind of more specific cultural phenomena that we've been talking about as postmodernism. I think the best framework I've ever heard in understanding this is the professional administrative class concept. And I think that, or excuse me, the professional managerial class.
Yeah, I think who
Um,
is it? Curtis Yarvin and some other people. Do who? I don't think he coined it. I forget who coined it though. But go on.
it is interesting to me, by the way, that this concept appears to be emanating from what you could, I guess, kind of call right wing sources. I don't know how accurate that characterization is at this point, because it's almost kind of like anything that isn't left is being labeled as right, largely by the left. But the PMC idea is very helpful to me because it really acts as such a great way to explain so much of what we're talking about here. Why a lot of people who seem to have like a lot of these very disparate ideological leanings would go to such extreme lengths to normalize what have traditionally been assumed by most people to be pretty extreme things. And I think a big part of the explanation for that is that the professional managerial class, a lot of it is based on the institutionalization of college debt. That's just like one really clear economic mechanism that I think you can point to demonstrate why this has kind of flared up so recently. But also, there is just an obvious inherent value to being a part of quote unquote polite society. And the more that you allow the sort of engineering class, the legalistic class, the administrative class, essentially, to really kind of control the cultural norms of the society, the like when you really allow that class of people, which was kind of conceived of as a service class, to sort of take over, which I would argue is, by the way, inevitable if they even exist. That's maybe another conversation. But, you know, I think the more you allow that process to happen, the more you run into this problem where you have this appeal to authority fallacy increasing in value. Because if you are a person who derives all of their value from their credentials rather than being held accountable for any sorts of results that you produce, such as, I mean, there are, to break it down into extremely simple terms, I mean, there are people who make things, and then there are people who sort of administrate institutions. Those are just kind of two broad ways of looking at society. And the institutional administrators, in part because they don't have any obvious results for their work, they're clearly incentivized to push everything in society towards a direction in which people like them have power, influence, and social value. So, why should we be surprised when a society run by universities is pushing all of these ideologies which directly benefit, if not directly the universities, then all of their outgrowths, right? All of their industries in which the universities are most embedded, the military industrial complex, the medical fields, all of these the publishing, whole sort of media empire. All of these things are pretty directly linked to universities. And of course, they want to promote a world in which universities are central. Why wouldn't they?
I'd even go further than like I'd expand that characterization to go past universities and just into like directly into the economic incentives of like international corporations. So like it's not just that there's a professional managerial class, but then there's also these other bureaucrats, like corporate bureaucrats, political bureaucrats, and we've gotten to a point, especially with let's say like food corporations or
Hmm.
natural gas corporations, like it's so much easier to just steal money than it is to actually create value. Like going back to what you're saying, like there's people who
Yes.
create value and then there's people who are PMC people, basically.
Right. Right.
So like I mean the way that breaks down I think in reality is that you've got people, I don't want to say leftist, but it's kind of like the person who believes in expanding bureaucracy, their idea of innovation is coming up with new ways to rob the treasuries of nation states. Like that's kind of how I see it.
Essentially,
So
yeah. They don't think of it in those terms. They won't talk about it in those terms, but that's what it translates to in the end.
right, like you get in because ultimately what you get into then is like the arguments that they end up making, bureaucrats of all kinds, is that we need government subsidies to make it safe for what, like that's one example of an argument they would use. Safety they would use, and they hinge their argument on the concept of safety, reducing harm, these things, and then as a result we need a $5 trillion bill, you
Yeah,
know.
and more people like me need jobs.
Right. Yeah, and then it becomes this vicious circle where it feeds itself, and then the bureaucracy and PMC continues to expand. And like, I mean, I don't know if you saw, but it's gotten to a point where, so in California, I just posted this on Twitter earlier. Let me find the headline here. So here's the headline: California officials cite Elon Musk's politics in rejecting SpaceX launches. So they won't let him launch rockets in California anymore, basically because they don't like a bunch of his tweets and his politics. So like it's
Mm-hmm.
really gotten to the point where like the PMC class will prevent innovation, economic development unless you're going along with them. So like, it really is at that point now in the United States.
Yeah, I think it should, again, not really surprise anyone. Yeah, I think it's a natural progression towards that. Whenever you empower that class to the degree that we have in the sort of post World War II nation state environment that arose at around that time, we created an entire identity. I mean, that's, the economic aspect of it is one thing, but I think to really understand a lot of this, you need to boil it down to the fact that entire cultures and communities grow up around these ways of living. You don't need to look much further than the extended suburbs of Washington, D.C., and the fact that that happens to be one of the highest value real estate markets in the country, at least, if not on planet Earth. You have this almost kind of pseudo aristocracy or sort of secondary aristocracy that has been created around this idea of being this hyper educated service class. A lot of these people, again, this is all kind of changing because of the way that student debt and, degree inflation and all these sorts of things are working. But still, to a large degree, you have this largely Ivy League educated class of people who are, at some point or other, through their ability to work the political process and the lobbying process, if they're cooperative enough, they can grow quite wealthy. There's this whole kind of socioeconomic system that develops around being these people who essentially take it upon themselves to decide, how institutions are meant to be controlled in a society which was founded to be a legislative democracy, not an administrative state. Now, you can debate the merits of that, especially at different jurisdictions, that is state versus federal or local, whatever. But it's pretty clear to see, especially if you track the history of the development of kind of administrative government and the university system, especially in the United States. And we've talked about this in the past too on the podcast. You see very clearly how it feeds itself. And one of the most tragic aspects of this is the way in which, the same incentives which create the growth of these institutions that we were just talking about, paying off student debt and just the social incentives of wanting to be a part of the bureaucratic class, they also disincentivize actually solving the problems that these people claim to be solving. The problem in creating these protected, as you said earlier, sort of sectors of government institutions, for example, and it's not only in government, I mean, this exists in the corporate sector as well. But the danger with creating them is that you're directly disincentivizing actually solving those problems. You'll almost never find any enthusiasm in large institutions for actually, like, if you talk to the people that work within them, they'll almost all every single one of them tell you, who has been working there long enough, that yeah, that's not really like, it's really more about just like everyone keeping their jobs, and kind of doing what the manager says.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think this is like a key underpinning of most of our views, like the understanding of this PMC and how these bureaucracies work. So, like, another point that I wanted to make was, like, we didn't just get lucky when we discussed mRNA gene therapy interventions or our view on monocrop agriculture or the war on Ukraine. Like, these aren't just like lucky guesses. Like, all of these
Mm-hmm.
things come from like a first principles understanding of how these institutions work in the real world. And then, like, that's how we form an opinion or an analysis of these issues. And like, if you don't understand that how an institution works or how a bureaucracy works or how the university system feeds all of this or the economic incentives behind it, well, then you just fundamentally don't really understand the issue. If
Yeah.
you're just repeating what you heard somebody say on TV in like the classic appeal to authority thing, I mean, like, I'm sorry, but that's not actually like a real analysis.
Yeah, not at all. And again, I don't think that most people are trying to analyze things in any serious way, and that's why appeals to authority are so appealing, to so many people, because they sort of give you, they relieve you, at least in a psychological or a social way, they relieve you of having to do any thinking or any choice making. You can just kind of go along with the crowd. And of course, there are, unfortunately, I don't know the name of the experiment, so I can't cite it specifically, but there was a famous experiment conducted where, they had people go into a room full of actors and get all of the actors, except for the one study participant, to all agree together to an obvious falsehood, and then kind of document the behavior of the one study participant. So, in other words, you walk into a room and it's all framed as like, hey, we're going to have some sort of like a survey discussion. And what, for whatever reason, 2 plus 2 is 5, and like you get everyone in the room to just like sort of raise their hand, and then see what the one person does, and and in the vast majority of cases, it sounds like, according to this study, the person goes along with the obviously false consensus in the room. And when interviewed later, they explain, well, it wasn't exactly as though I thought 2 plus 2 was 5, but I guess I just felt like all those people couldn't possibly be wrong. I thought there must have been something with my perception, but I think that's a big part of the difference. I mean, tying it back into COVID, between the type of thinking that is being promoted in popular media, and by the political class in general, and the kind of thinking that I think we're trying to promote a little bit of, is we presuppose that we can trust our senses and our perceptions. We dare to claim, as grown adult human beings of sound mind and body, that we can tell more or less what's going on. And I really think at the core level, that is a lot of what drives the divide, the largely, by the way, generational divide in our society today, is this sense that a lot of people have, who have, despite this, managed to kind of create functional public lives, right? Like, they have sort of jobs and are on paper sort of well-adjusted citizens, but the reality is that they lack the basic confidence in their own senses and their own perception. And so it becomes much easier to presuppose that the authority figures, whoever they really are telling the truth and have your own best interests at heart, especially if your day-to-day experience is so detached from reality that you don't know where any of it is coming from. As long as your belly's full and you have enough screen time to keep you satisfied, I mean, how many questions are you really going to ask?
Yeah, and take on the university system directly ties into this, I think, too, because we basically created this broader culture where it's just like a total midwit society where a huge percentage of people are going to universities, and because they go to a university, they think they're like an intellectual elite and deserve to have these opinions on Ukraine or opinions on vaccines or whatever it is. Like, because they feel they're this overeducated class, they feel entitled to have opinions about all of these things that they literally know nothing about.
Nothing about.
So I think like humility in analysis is probably one of the most important factors in analytical ability, is having humility. For example, I mean, I've probably mentioned this before, but when we worked together at a geopolitical analysis firm, I remember I came from a finance background. So like I didn't really know anything about Egypt or Israel or like a lot of these places that I covered. Like I literally knew nothing. So like it made no sense for me to pretend like I knew something. Like I wasn't, it would just be
Right.
ridiculous if I did
Right.
that. I mean, we're working with people who were formerly in the intelligence community and military who were like actually in these places, some of them for decades, that like understood on the ground what was actually happening. But one of the most shocking things to me, I remember, was like kids that I went to, like, there were a couple kids that I went to school with who worked at this firm with us. And like right out of college, they would just be like having opinions about places
Right.
where people that we worked with were military veterans and people that actually knew it, like knew everything about these places, and these kids would feel confident enough to like have an opinion about it. And I just couldn't believe that they would do that. Like, to me, that was completely insane. That like, oh, you had like, you're 22-year-old girl who graduated with a degree in journalism from like some fancy school, and you have an opinion about like the regime in Iran, really?
It is really astounding, the arrogance of it. It's really kind of amazing. I mean, all you can do is sort of smile and, try and be patient when again, there is often a clear age component too. So I do think that makes it a little bit easier to forgive in a sense. But I just think it's worth acknowledging that there are levels of insight to everything, and that's another presupposition. It sounds like you had a little bit of that understanding because maybe you come from a background or a tradition where just the concept, the presupposition, if you will, of respecting one's elders is a little bit more clearly instilled. And, maybe you don't, let me just talk about myself here. I mean, I come from that kind of a background, which is very sort of age based hierarchy. And it's something that I've kind of had a little bit of push and pull with in my life. I don't necessarily go all the way with it, but that just on its face seems to me like on a social level. By the way, this is such a good indicator of where like these little kind of, for lack of a better word, grandmother's lessons, these little social norms that a lot of people carry out without necessarily understanding why can be such indicators of things that are a little bit more intellectually sound. And this is a great example. On the one hand, you could say, like you said it, how could you possibly know what you're talking about when you lack experience in such a profound way? You don't even have enough context to formulate an insightful question, and you're expressing your opinions. It should be totally absurd on an intellectual level. But also, your grandmother told you to not get into arguments with people who are older than you and who have, XYZ reasons to be explaining something to you. You should listen.
Yeah, I mean, so personally, my background is in trading and investing. And that's like a particular field where if you're going to risk your own capital and put it up, I mean, you have to know what you're talking about. So, like, oftentimes, like, traders will talk, like, what do you think about this stock or that company or whatever? And, like, you don't gain anything by pretending to know something or
Mm-hmm.
like lying about it. I mean, in fact, you'll not only will you just look dumb if you're talking
Yeah.
to somebody that actually knows. For example, if somebody asks me about a company, I need to know the incentives of the entire industry, what products that company has, how the whole business works. So like I've heard of like say Salesforce, right? I don't
Mm-hmm.
know anything about Salesforce. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know how that company works. I don't know what I mean, I know they're in technology, but I don't really understand the industry. So like if somebody asks me if I know anything about Salesforce, no, tell me about it. I know absolutely nothing about it. So like if I'm looking at that as something that I'm going to invest in, I need to learn about it. So if you know about it, tell me about it. Like I'm going to ask you questions about it then. That's another thing. Like during the COVID thing, these people wouldn't even ask any questions. So like when you find people that aren't asking questions, you know they're not actually analyzing the issue or trying to understand it.
Oh yeah, and that tells you a lot in and of itself, right? Like if they're pushing that hard and they're not really trying to understand it, well, they're clearly afraid, right? Like they're clear that it's clearly a sort of a herd mentality going on when you have people not just not asking questions, but actively demonizing and in many cases all but physically attacking, but certainly publicly attacking verbally in all sorts of ways people who do ask questions. It's
See,
just
this is where it goes, where the PMC thing goes beyond just like the direct managers of the society, but also into middle managers at corporations and even just like lower
yeah,
level analysts. Because like to them, they aren't putting their capital or their money up and making calls on it as you would as a trader or an investor, where there's direct consequences for that. So there actually is value for them, or social clout or social value, in leading you to think that they know something about it, or in
that's what it
having the
is.
correct opinion
That's
that is
what it
promoted by
is.
the institution. Yeah, and they know that. And so like for me, the corporations that I've worked for, that was always the most difficult thing for me to take, was that you would have people that are either lying or leading on that they know more than they know. And I just, as like a, from a trading mentality, I just could not handle that. Cause like, you know, that if you cornered them and you were like, well, tell me more about that.
Yeah.
What do you know about that? You know, they wouldn't be able to say anything. And then even if they did get cornered, there was nothing that, there's no like repercussion to that, you know,
Well, there's
especially if they
usually
have the right opinion.
yeah, there's usually some right. I mean, number one, in many cases, it's like everyone else in the room will, like back them up in some weird way. That basically amounts to just like shouting down a person who is critically asking any sorts of questions, asking because then it goes into this whole narrative that's popular now about preserving people's feelings and making people feel safe, and so a lot of people I think use that as a little bit of a cudgel in those scenarios. But for sure, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said it's this like I actually think this version of it that comes at this kind of middle management tier. I'm not even talking about like the big managers. I'm not talking about the people with big houses in Maryland and Virginia. I'm talking about like the dorks that I work with, who make like very little money, but emulate these ideas. They agree with these ideas and talk very, very vocally about COVID's a really good example, I think, that's really easy for people to use as an identity thing. And they'll talk about a lot of these things in a way that makes them sound like they have the same opinions as the fancy New York and San Francisco people. And yeah, that's their version of wearing the daddy pants, wearing the fancy uniform, and they feel like they're a part of a class that they're totally not a part of, that doesn't give a fuck about them. And it is a very sad thing to see. It manifests itself not only on the left in a lot of different ways. It's just like a lot of human psychology that's pretty obvious plays into that. People want to be a part of something, but it's so gross when people do it in a way that very sort of cynically throws other people under the bus, even if it's just in a social way.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit in the last podcast, but again, I think it comes down to incentives. Like if you don't understand the incentives, then you don't really understand anything. So we talked about it in the context of Bill Gates last time and how he promotes the climate change and some of those ideas because he's heavily invested in certain agriculture and other startups that like would capitalize on that vision of the future and understanding of the present, right? So like it makes sense why he would advocate for such things. But then like why are you as some lower analyst at some Fortune 500 firm echoing
Mm-hmm.
these things so passionately if you have no tie to it, and really like it's again, I don't even think they realize that they're doing it. So what you're fundamentally doing is aligning yourself with Bill Gates's investment strategy, but they just don't understand that this is what's going on, you know. And I guess that is the form of, that is the purpose of propaganda and other things, to get people to do these things. But and
Yeah,
yeah, it creates that social pressure, and that like the social clout is kind of like the currency that they trade in, instead of like actual capital or creating any value. Because I mean, fundamentally, like what the PMC people and all of this is really are people who don't actually create any value. And I think there's like a certain
exactly.
self-consciousness that comes with that, like whether
Exactly.
you subconsciously understand that or not. It's kind of like, well, I have to say this if it's going to further my career or whatever, because if that doesn't work out, I don't know where I'm going to be, you know?
Exactly. Well, and then also such a big part of what often is sacrificed in the pursuit of that kind of professional educated identity are things which are really the basis of a healthy human identity as a man or woman. You know, your physical health, you know, for example, that so many people who are, you know, quote unquote successful are obviously sacrificing if you just take a look at how many of them are obese. So there's just like this total disregard of reality, again, as you were saying earlier. But I think that's it's the thing is, it feeds into this much kind of deeper layer of it, because it's as you're sacrificing the physical health aspect, for example, your fundamental fulfillment as a human being goes down. You know, as you're sacrificing access to sunlight and time outdoors, you know, your fundamental health and physical substance is being degraded. And I think that, you know, I mean, this plays into all sorts of, it's like, for example, there's a lot of talk about the modern male experience and kind of how young men are failing to adapt to the challenges of being husbands and fathers and dating and all of this kind of stuff. And so, in that context, if we are educating and training all of the boys in the society to prioritize what can be described as academic or sort of managerial administrative pursuits, and we are to seeing the result of that being manifested in the physical and psychological health of the society. How is that going to affect the states of mind of those men when they become husbands and fathers? And how is that in turn going to feed into their actions as administrators of these institutions? Am I making sense? I know that was kind of a rambling way to describe that, but basically, if it's like on top of all of those obvious perverse incentives, then there's the fact that because I'm spending all my time looking at a stupid screen or dealing with Excel spreadsheets or whatever inane nonsense they've got you doing, I'm like, I don't feel like as much of a man. I'm probably getting into all sorts of horrible arguments with my spouse. I probably don't have a very healthy or fulfilling relationship with my children. I mean, these are, I'm kind of speculating in a little bit of an extreme, broad way. I recognize that. But I mean, this applies to so many people. And it's like, how does that whole experience, that whole vibe of your everyday life affect your decision making as a government official, as a manager of some corporate entity which has control over critical infrastructure, for example? It's kind of horrifying to really think about the larger repercussions, excuse me, of that. They're immeasurable, but they can't be good. I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, if you haven't listened to it or watched it, you should watch Callie and Casey Means on Rogan. They were on last week. It's one of the best episodes I think he's ever done, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But they talk about that too, and like they frame it as it's kind of like an estrogenic society that we've developed, and fundamentally, I mean, it's just emasculating. And I think, like, I tweeted this last week. I said,
Yeah.
if like man in corporate environment becomes woman, like that, I think that's really what it's like. If the goal of the company is safety, like these are like the DEI things are safety.
Yeah.
These are all like feminine concepts, you know.
Yeah, they're not even just feminine, by the way. I mean, I hate to interrupt, but I don't want to lose track of this thought. I just want to cite the amazing episode that Michael Malice did with your boy, what was his name? Bronze Age Pervert. I don't know nearly enough about that guy except that, like, just from
Everybody should
hearing
follow him. He's the best account on Twitter.
he is. I don't know enough about like everything that he thinks, and certainly I don't agree with even a few of the things that he said in that. But he is clearly a brilliant thinker, and one of the concepts that he laid out super compellingly in that episode was the idea of the Longhouse and this manner in which and he framed it in terms of kind of like leftist thinking and kind of Marxist thinking, the idea of communalism. But I think you could just, even without bringing that into it, there seems to be this dynamic in our society. Let's even just like take any of the philosophical factors out of it. Like, this is so clearly happening. People talk about gerontocracy left and right. And again, the Longhouse, for those of you who don't know, is this idea that a society is essentially being run by old women. And I think so many of, and not necessarily, I mean, not necessarily women, you know, there are a lot of old men running things too. But I think there is this way in which it may be just by virtue of the fact that they live a little bit longer than men, that old ladies tend to just sort of de facto end up in these positions of control over especially smaller communities. I think that's the point that he was making.
Yeah, I want to shout out to
Please.
Lomez too. I think he wrote the initial article on the Longhouse, Lomez, and then I think Bronze Age ran with it. So I just wanted to give credit to him.
Yeah.
But yeah, Bronze Age also does a great episode on his podcast where he talks about, I forget if it was him or his guest, but they were talking about, I think specifically in reference to Germany and their COVID response, how it literally is just like old people who are afraid of death that are making decisions about the entire, not like not only their society but the entire world, and it's literally these decrepit old people that are stifling youth and vitality across the world, and it's
It
really
is.
it's the most disgusting thing happening in the
Oof,
world.
it is one of the least, I think, in terms of things that are not talked about with the level of urgency that they merit. It's one of the worst. I mean, the absolute absurdity of the situation that we find ourselves in as a generation, having empowered, you know, largely with a lot of the New Deal reforms that took place in the 1930s, if we're talking about the US. But throughout the developed world, you know, I mean, the sort of pension systems that were put in place and social security, so all these kinds of things. It's amazing to me that no one ever considered that we were setting ourselves up to live in a society of extremely old people. And we see it, I see it manifested constantly in my own work. I work in a relatively high end restaurant with an open kitchen. And it's just so bizarre, doesn't even begin to describe it. But to see that almost all of the people that have the kind of disposable income required to eat at a place like that are over 60 years old. And whoever thought when they were arguing in favor of all of these, you know, sort of programs, it's not just the welfare state stuff, by the way. A lot of it has to do with the fact that, you know, these people were incentivized to sell their houses in the 1990s and pretty much pulled the economic rug out from under our generation, in a sense. But this dynamic of gerontocracy and of the Longhouse, whatever you want to call it, is really enough to make one's blood boil. You know, it is and COVID was like a monument to it. It was one of the most perversely horrifying displays of let's sacrifice at all costs, pretty much, the young's the welfare and well-being of the young and the needs of not just the young, like everyone, who's in decent health, for the not even the peculiar needs, but the peculiar concerns, of this class of decrepit old monsters who have, hobbled the society in so many ways through their consumption and their ignorance. Not that it's exactly their fault on an individual level. I don't think they really understood what they were doing, of course, but it's just like, how badly do you have to fuck up before you think about maybe sitting down, and it surprises me that some of these people don't feel a little bit more socially compelled to just quietly release the levers of control in society. But then I will say, to sort of play the devil's advocate, and this is a valid response to that, I think there's a large degree to which the people of the older generation who still do control a lot of these institutions are looking around at the younger generation and wondering who the hell is going to replace them. I mean, number one, just in terms of number, there aren't very many of us, and this plays into the immigration issue in interesting ways. But they're also just seeing the general level of education and skill sets and specializations that our generation in many ways lacks, in large part due to the university system that we were talking about, which has been pumping out worthless degrees at an alarming rate for decades now. And so I think a lot of these old fucks are sitting there with their finger on, like keeping the I don't know, whatever metaphor you want to put in place here. It's just like they're sitting there in control of some piece of critical infrastructure. And I think it's in some ways probably kind of unfair to blame them for not wanting to let go, because they don't know who the hell is going to take over.
Well, I think it's worse than that. I think they have a deep paranoia of anybody that could ever replace them. And I think you could directly tie this into the estrogenic society now, in that that's a strategy for them to limit opposition. So if they could feminize the culture and emasculate men, well, then who's going to challenge their authority and their power? And I think, to tie it back to something you said,
there's a lot to that.
Yeah, to tie it back to something you said at the beginning of the episode, it's interesting that all of the opposition to global liberal policies are from the right wing. I think that's not a coincidence, because that's the only sector of the political landscape that even values masculinity and isn't directly attacking masculinity, So, and I think that's the reason why they don't want these populist movements. I mean, obviously they don't want it because they want to disempower nation states, and I think the way that you do that is by disempowering the men of that country. I mean, take Ukraine, for example. I mean, they just sent all of the young men to war, so I mean, they're done. That country's done,
Yeah.
I mean, most of these European countries, I mean, Germany, probably the most feminized country in Europe. I mean, there's like I don't know too much about Germany, so I don't want to discuss it too much, but I mean, just utterly neutered. I mean, these countries are just neutered. The men are neutered, and it's the food supply, it's the social engineering, you can't say whether it's done by design necessarily or not. I think it's kind of hard to make a statement on that, but there's no question that feminizing the society benefits the current rulers of the society.
So true. I mean, by the way, most of the famous dictatorships in history, particularly the Nazi Party and the Soviet Union, both were largely appealing to feminist organizations and women, in particular in the kind of industrial administrative class. And in both of those societies, it made a lot of sense at that stage in their economic development, because they were heavily industrializing. And I mean, what that basically comes down to is that you had a lot of work for women. You had a lot of work for teachers, and all, and secretaries, and people like that. And so there really grew this whole movement out of appealing to the, the rather cynical economic considerations, not so much of women individually, but kind of as a collective industrial lobby almost, which they became in the industrial era. And I think that is a direct, there's again that economic component to it, incentive wise, but then yes, there's this component of emasculating men. And let's not forget separating children from their mothers. That's a big one. The schooling system. That's also a big one as it relates to emasculating men, I think, in lots of subtle ways.
Well,
But
I mean, not only is that emasculating men, but it's defeminizing women
yeah, yeah,
properly, because women are, every angle of it is worse than it seems. Like, it's not only are men
yeah,
being emasculated, but it's that women are being masculated. I don't know, is that the word, masculine? Women are becoming more masculine
right.
and becoming defeminized. So, like,
Yeah,
it's actually like you're making both ends of the spectrum again inverted and worse. So then, like, women don't even know how to be women anymore. Men don't. I mean, maybe there's less relationships, less children now because men don't even like
yeah.
this, aren't
Yep,
attracted to this
that
version of
right,
woman,
that and also these women who are constantly being put in positions where they have to act like men and very often suck at it are constantly being made to feel like losers, which that's because they are being put in a position that they are not well suited to.
Oh, I wonder why so many women are on antidepressants.
Yeah. And again, by the way, and this is sort of the one big qualification I'll make to all this, using the Longhouse theory as a reference, what I do understand of it, because I'm not super well versed in it. But all of that being said, I do not necessarily want to live in a society where old ladies don't have any power. Okay. I think there's a lot of value in incorporating the older generation in ways that are truly functional and meaningful. I just think that number one, that largely takes place at the family level. Yeah, and that's just kind of one of the most effective ways to express that is to empower older people to be grandparents. But I think really the issue is, just like with the administrative class, the university class, the issue is there's like a difference between giving someone a role and having them take over, I mean, you can give your retarded cousin a job sweeping the floor at the construction site. There's a difference between that and making him the foreman, or letting him drive the crane. There are obvious levels to things that different types of individuals are better or worse suited for. And old ladies should not be determining the larger values of the society because they don't have much of a stake in it.
See, this is where it gets even more sinister. And I think it's directly relevant to the political situation now in the United States. I don't want to make it too political, so I won't use any names or anything. But I mean, you can see it directly now where the PMC and the institutional incentives and international corporations actually prefer weak and incompetent leadership
I
because they could
experience it all the
exploit
time.
it. They
Yep.
could exploit it and take advantage of it. So you see the current president, who nobody like even knows what this guy is doing. He's clearly been having mental issues for at least 6 years, I would say, and it's been very obvious. But that's actually what these people want. They want to just be able to do what they want to do. So, like, who's running the country? Like, the system is running the country, and that's how
Exactly.
they want it. So they don't want anybody of any strong moral clarity or conviction in charge of any country. They don't want any of that. They
That's right.
want their systems to run the whole thing. And
That's
that's
right.
kind of the danger with some of the AI stuff, is just surrendering agency to it. But I mean, it's tough. I don't want to get into a whole AI discussion, but it's tough with the AI thing, because things really are so bad that it might only get better. like any sort of innovation might actually just make it better. 10 years ago I would have said, oh, like that'd definitely be like AI would definitely be for the worse. Like if we turned important decision making over to AI systems, that would make it worse. I'm not so convinced of that anymore, because I mean, it's 100% guaranteed that all of the countries in the West are going to do whatever these institutions force them, and the PMC force them to do anyway. So some sort of innovation or disruption in that process, you can make an argument that might offer at least a chance of a different outcome, because what we have now is there is no chance of any other outcome, you know.
Well, I mean that is a long discussion, but I do want to say that there's a lot to your point at the political level, and of just like kind of having people in positions of supposed control or sort of bureaucratic control who are inherently non-threatening. I think that there's an obvious, it's, I was going to say, you were talking about it in the political context, but in my experience, it's obviously manifested in the way that a lot of the employers that I have worked for seem to have a very clear preference for hiring older people, hiring divorced single moms, hiring teenagers, and really anyone who is sort of vulnerable, kind of doesn't really get what they're doing or why, and is going to be easy to push around, to disorient, and kind of get to coerce that person into doing whatever you sort of snap at them that you want them to do. And I think that that works from the level of Joe Biden all the way down to your kid washing dishes at a pizzeria who's 15 years old. I mean, I think those lessons are learned early, and that culture sort of spreads throughout the site. That is a big part of what that Longhouse thing is.
That could go all the way to the top. Like one more point that I wanted to make is that like the way a
Please.
corporation actually works, it's not even that the CEO isn't in charge of the corporation, at least in most cases. Like the CEO is not the majority shareholder of most corporations.
Mm-hmm.
Like Zuckerberg is. That's why he's been able to stay on at Facebook despite the board wanting to get him out. But the board can just replace you if you're
Mm-hmm.
the CEO at not, I don't know what percent, like 90+% of corporations, right? So
Mm-hmm.
like even at the CEO level, they want to go back to the feminizing thing. It's like they want basically like the people who really control the things, they want like a secretary in charge.
Absolutely.
So then they
Absolutely.
don't have to take any of the blowback. They could just replace you if something goes wrong. And so like they will put incompetent people that they know are incompetent at the absolute highest level of even international corporations. And that's really the situation we're in right now.
Yeah. No, it's very true. It's extremely alarming. And I actually did before we start wrapping up here, I wanted to briefly share a little bit of my experience dealing with this local organization that I've been dealing with here in my community. I'm going to be careful not to really get into too much detail because I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but just kind of trying to tie in all these concepts that we've been talking about in a functional way. As I've talked about before, I cook professionally and I work full time at a pretty high end restaurant. But in my off time, I like to try and make as much headway as I can in the process of developing my own trade. And a lot of that involves just sort of finding ways to cook for people that I don't necessarily make any money off of, but really I'm just kind of like marketing myself and my brand, for lack of a better way of putting it. And one of the ways that it occurred to me I might be able to do that is by joining, informally at least, a little nonprofit organization that was originally started with a very specific goal in mind, which was to restore a local historic building. And what has recently reinvigorated me with this organization is that they made a change to their mission statement, which has officially omitted any talk of revitalizing or restoring this historic building, which is, I won't get into the details again, but it's not a feasible project. The building was not built to last. Let's just leave it at that. And has changed the charter to reflect that this organization is dedicated to investing in the community or enhancing community activity. I forget the exact language. And so I've been kind of now, the reason I'm talking about this is because this organization is full of old ladies. Okay. There is one other person who participates regularly in it who is more or less my age, and everyone else just kind of, shows up every now and then. But the core members are all over the age of 50, at least, probably 60. And you really kind of see this dynamic at play because there's a very clear way in which in particular, the one lady who is the chairperson of this organization, is very, very resistant to any efforts which actually promote the spirit of that charter, and essentially uses that organization as a social club, as like a hobby that she works on. And they have like bingo nights and all these kinds of things. So they do all these old lady things, that they like to do, and they literally, like, they use this thing as a platform for that. And it's one of the most perverse and obscene things I've ever seen in my life. It's just like this, such a cynical, because it's like they could even still do that and also kind of set a little money aside to just kind of invest in people at a very grassroots level, very easy level. There's not much they'd have to do at all, but they just like don't like it. They don't care. They don't want to promote economic resiliency in this very small, depressed town. They want to kind of hang on to not only their social status, but they don't have to spend little bits of money on bingo, for example, just even things like that. But the cynicism of just kind of doing that is really mind blowing to me in a society, in a sector of society which you would think is the most oriented towards the future. You sort of think of the older generation as being those who are supposed to be thinking about the future and thinking in multi-generational terms because they've lived through so much of their lives, and they should kind of have that retrospective insight. But I think it speaks so clearly to the degeneracy of our culture in what we call the developed world, that we really can't count on our older people to do anything that would be considered the right thing in many cases. They are desperately, cynically trying to stay on a sinking ship, as long as they possibly can. And it's manifested at every level, so I guess I'll let that close out my rant, but for sure look into the whole Longhouse theory. It is extremely fascinating in terms of perspectives to understand what we experience every day.
This isn't the Aspen Institute you're talking about, is it?
Yeah. No,
See, now
definitely.
imagine. So, I mean, the way most of these NGOs work financially is that they're set up by people that are trying to use it as a tax shelter. So,
Mhm.
there's economic incentives for people to tie up their money in these various NGOs because that reduces their tax bracket and
Uh-huh.
how much they owe in taxes. So, like when you see Warren Buffett or Bill Gates putting billions of dollars in these foundations, this is all nonsense. It's a tax shelter, and they
Mhm.
even could use the tax shelter as an investment vehicle to invest in other startups and other corporations that could even earn them more money on top of it. So, like, there's absolutely nothing legitimate about any of that. I think all NGOs should be shut down. I don't think NGOs should be allowed to exist. I don't think they should have special tax status. At least maybe that would be the way that you would do it. But I've yet to find. And then, I mean, not to get into a whole thing about NGOs, but I mean, even the Catholic Church, the
It's
Red
worth getting into,
Cross,
by the way, if we're going to
these
go on a rant
NGOs.
on anything.
I mean, like the Catholic Church gets most of its revenue from the United States government. And the reason they get money from the government is to resettle refugees. So when you give money to the Catholic Church, you're literally facilitating the resettlement of illegal immigrants across the United States. That's 100% true. You could look it up. And it's the same thing for the Red Cross and many of these other NGOs. So like whatever the stated mission is, they don't even have to abide by the stated mission at all. And I mean, in many cases, like you're saying, they literally do the exact opposite of the stated mission.
They don't only just do it, they're incentivized to do it, right? It's almost like you're looking at it and you're going, well, what else would they do? They're trying to keep their jobs.
And it gets even worse than that, because the ones that become successful enough, like the Aspen Institute and some of these other ones, not only do they become various cutouts for intelligence agencies, like where the former director of the CIA, I forget which one, but like he speaks at the Aspen Institute, and then they pay him a bunch of money to speak there. And then the Aspen Institute gets a bunch of grants and stuff from the federal government. Mm-hmm. So imagine if your local NGO was not only doing the like what you're talking about, but then that they were being subsidized by the taxpayers to do it. So like not only would they be getting tax advantageous status for the people that are running it, and they're not advancing the mission, but then they're also burning taxpayer dollars in order to do it. Like
totally,
the NGO system is so bad on literally every level that I honestly think the whole thing should just be shut down.
It is interesting. I mean, without getting into whether or not it should be shut down, it is interesting to look at the genesis of it, which, as far as I know, was largely around the Rockefeller Foundation, and how that legal battle, which is really what it was to the best. I mean, I don't know a whole ton about this, but I remember reading about how he had to lobby for quite a while in the state of New York to first, at the level of that state, get legislation passed, which allowed for what we essentially understand as like charitable organizations today, 501c3s, I believe, is what they are. But, you know, and then that set the precedent, which allowed it to be legalized on a federal level. But the point I'm making is that this is much more recent, I think, than people realize. And the reason I say that is because, you know, whether or not I'm saying it should be banned, there's definitely an argument to make that the idea of NGOs is not exactly in keeping with the spirit of what a representative democracy is supposed to look like, and what like a legislative government, you know, in other words, a government administered by legislation, in other words, by lawmakers, by laws getting passed and amendments and things, as opposed to hiring administrative bureaucrats, right? Like the laws, the administration of towns, for example, used to be done by town councils. But now you just hire you have a town hall, and it's full of people whose permanent job titles are, well, you're just the bureaucrat that's in charge of this system. And I mean, this doesn't work perfectly. You know, there are certain things, for example, snow removal in Vermont, you know, you're always going to have year in, year out, you're always going to have a need for that. That is an unsolvable problem. But there are problems which are very much intended to be solved, at least if you take into account the idea of, you know, doing it at that level. I mean, at the level of a town, for example, if you're a city, if you have a Department of Housing, which their stated goal is to provide housing, right? They would want to be doing things like eradicating homelessness. The reality of that situation is, if you make that a permanent institution and you give someone job title of, you know, homeless mitigator, first class, whatever you call them, the only incentive in the world they do not have is to solve the homelessness problem. Because if they do that, then what would the need for a Department of Housing be? There would be none. And so it's this, it really is this disgustingly obvious way of incentivizing the exact opposite of what they claim to be doing. And in so doing, again, it feeds into this PSYOP component that we've been talking about, where you're getting the entire society to repeat in unison that 2 + 2 is 5. You know, you're calling these people by these titles, you know, oh, I work for the so-and-so, and this is the senator, and this is the president, you know, and I'm the department of this and this. And it's like, anyone with eyes to see, anyone with any sort of discernment sees very clearly that these people are not trying to do what they say they're doing. They're keeping themselves employed.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to one of the things I said earlier, where if you look at it through the lens of, are these people creating value? I think that's like a deeper concept than most people think. I mean, like, you could read like some of the Austrian economists like Hayek, Rothbard, some of these people like
Mm-hmm.
libertarians also, where if you aren't fundamentally creating value, like what are you actually doing, and why should you be given money or resources? So like, I mean,
What a
just
crazy question, right? Like,
in regards to the homeless thing, there's got to be some way for some business to create value by addressing the homeless issue. And if there's not, well, then we probably just shouldn't be involved in it. In the way you're describing, like, I know there's many examples in San Francisco where like some of these bureaucrats make like hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to solve homelessness or whatever, and it only gets worse every year. Like, that can't be the outcome. Like, it
of
really doesn't
course.
take long to recognize that that can't be the outcome too. The fact that it goes on for like more than a quarter or 2 quarters in a fiscal year is completely insane.
It's
And
completely insane. It
I
really is.
think I'm going to butcher it. Aaron McIntyre on Twitter has a great aphorism for this, where it's like it's something like, the purpose of an institution is what it does. And it's sort of like, the idea is like,
Uh-huh.
disregard whatever it says.
Right.
Like, if we're giving millions of dollars in grants to this homeless NGO or government agency or whatever, and it's actually making the problem worse, well, then functionally that's the purpose of it. Like, that's the
Right.
purpose of the institution. So like,
Exactly.
and like, you could borne that out in financial accounting. You would see that that's going on after 2 consecutive quarters of that. You could see that that's what's going on.
And I will take it a step further, just tying it into what we were saying earlier about kind of trusting your own senses and your own faculties. Even if you don't have some kind of process of reasoning that proves that to you, you should assume that that is the purpose of that institution, because that's what it looks like. That is how you're experiencing it. It doesn't just look like that, that's what's playing out. So it's just like, I think there's such a point to be made for saving yourself the heartache and the consternation of analyzing too much, when, especially when you see so very clearly the result.
It's like, if a problem is getting worse, then nobody's really trying to solve it. I mean, that's kind of just
Right.
the reality.
Right.
Like,
Right. And even if there were any evidence that like, you should assume they're not, like, I just think that there's inherent value to that heuristic. You have, it's important to learn the value of categorizing things to a degree when they, especially when you're talking about human behavior in the collective. It's like there's a clear pattern here, and it's to your strategic advantage to recognize it and act like it's real, and not spend, because it's just not practical to spend too much time worrying about whether or not it might be real.
okay, thanks guys.
Thank you.